Hello friends, I am glad to see you again. Today I'm going to tell you about a neighbor who thinks the price of her car has an impact. I have lived in a small, peaceful neighborhood for almost 5 years, and until recently, I never had any serious problems with my neighbors. My house sits on a decent-sized lot, surrounded by tall hedges, a small fence in the front yard, and a gated entry that leads to a gravel driveway large enough for my 2 vehicles. I inherited this property from my dad, and over the years, I've made careful improvements, landscaping the front yard, building a greenhouse in the backyard, and laying down pavers near the garage. Most of the people on my street have always been respectful of boundaries, eager to wave hello when we pass each other, and quick to give a friendly nod. However, a few months ago, one of the neighbors, let's call her Sarah, her other name is Karen, she moved into a rental home down the street and started stirring up drama I never expected. Everything began innocently enough when I noticed a sleek, expensive-looking car parked partially on my driveway one morning. The front end was angled in such a way that it blocked my own access. At first, I assumed it might belong to a visitor who got confused or accidentally turned into my driveway to turn around. I shrugged it off, figuring they'd move soon. My morning routine involved heading to my part-time job in the city, so I left a polite note on the windshield. The note read something along the lines of, "Hello, please don't park on this property. Thank you for understanding." I then managed to squeeze my car out of the driveway and went about my day. When I returned that afternoon, I was surprised to find the same car there, this time fully parked on my gravel pad. My note was nowhere to be found, and no one seemed to be around outside. Still puzzled but trying to stay calm, I knocked on a few neighbors' doors to see if anyone recognized the vehicle. Eventually, I learned it belonged to Sarah, a resident a few houses down. Apparently, she had moved here for a new job in town and was known for her rather flashy style. Several neighbors commented that Sarah drove that fancy car around with a kind of arrogance, often letting the engine idle loudly in the early morning. No one had confronted her about it before because it hadn't affected them directly. Now it was my turn to learn more about Sarah's personality. I decided to address the situation face to face. The next morning, when her car was once again on my property, I waited until around noon, on my day off, before walking down the street to knock on her door. Sarah answered, peering out from behind the partially open door with an expression that suggested irritation. She was dressed in business casual attire, and the interior behind her looked modern but somewhat barren, as if she had just moved in. I politely introduced myself, explained that I owned the property where her car was parked, and asked her to move it. Without breaking eye contact, she said, "I don't see a problem. There's plenty of room on your driveway, and my car's worth a small fortune. If anything, you should be proud it's gracing your land." I stood there, utterly stunned by her brazen attitude. When I insisted that she needed my permission to park on private property, she just flipped her hair over her shoulder and closed the door, effectively shutting down the conversation. After that brief encounter, I tried once more to be the bigger person by leaving another note, more direct this time. "Parking on my property without permission is not allowed. Please remove your vehicle. If you continue, I will contact local authorities." I left it on her windshield the following morning. By the time I got back from a quick grocery run, the note was torn and tossed on the ground near the curb. Her car remained in the same spot, angled in a way that practically blocked me from parking my own vehicle in my designated space. I began to suspect that Sarah's behavior was less about confusion and more about entitlement. That suspicion only grew stronger with each passing day. Since I valued peaceful coexistence, I decided to try talking to Sarah one last time, hoping to keep this from escalating. Early that evening, I noticed she was outside, snapping photos of her car for what looked like a social media post. I took a deep breath and approached, reminding myself to be calm. I greeted her politely and asked, "Please, could you find another spot to park? This is my private property." She glanced at me, exhaled dramatically, and responded, "I've already told you, my car is too valuable. I'm not going to damage it by parking on the street. Besides, you have all this extra space you're not even using." I explained how her car was preventing me from accessing my own garage, to which she simply smirked and said, "Then maybe you should build a bigger garage." That comment blew me away. This was no simple misunderstanding. She genuinely believed that her fancy car warranted special privileges, and she seemed to think my property was free for her to use. I warned her that if she continued to park there, I'd have to involve law enforcement. She rolled her eyes, hopped into her car, and drove away, revving the engine. I felt the tension in my jaw as I walked back to my house. Deep down, I was determined not to let her trample all over my rights as a homeowner. Days passed, and the situation only got worse. Sarah would park her vehicle either partially or completely on my gravel driveway. Sometimes she even angled it so that both her front wheels were on my lawn, creating muddy ruts in the grass. The worst part was that she barely used her car daily. It often just sat there for hours or even overnight. I snapped photos for evidence, thinking that it would come in handy if I needed to file a complaint. I also made a brief log of each incident, noting the time, date, and the extent to which her car obstructed my driveway. My hope was that the mere threat of legal consequences would nudge Sarah to back off, but it never seemed to faze her. Around this time, I also started a side project of fixing up my backyard greenhouse in preparation for the upcoming season. I grow heirloom tomatoes, peppers, and a variety of herbs as both a hobby and a way to supplement my grocery budget. It's always been a source of pride, and my dad used to do it when he owned the house, so there's a sentimental value there too. With Sarah's car constantly blocking the path, however, I found it increasingly difficult to bring supplies in and out. There was even a day I had to haul bags of potting soil from the street, all the way around the side yard, just to avoid scratching her precious car that was illegally planted on my driveway. One Sunday afternoon, my cousin Francis came over to help me. He's a pretty relaxed and good-natured guy, but the moment he saw Sarah's car dominating my driveway, his eyebrows shot up. He asked, "Is this normal around here now?" I explained the entire saga, from the initial discovery of her car to her dismissive and entitled responses. Francis shook his head in disbelief. "You can't let her get away with this," he said. "You have rights, this is your land." He helped me put up a few homemade signs stating, "Private property, no unauthorized parking." We staked them into the ground near the edge of the driveway and at the boundary line by the sidewalk. I hoped, perhaps naively, that this clear signage would resolve the issue. The following day, Sarah's reaction to the signs was to tear them out of the ground and toss them aside like trash. I found them strewn in my yard. At this point, I realized this wasn't just about parking. She was actively defying my property rights. The utter disregard for my boundaries infuriated me. I took photos of the broken signs and marched inside to call a non-emergency line for advice. The dispatcher told me I had every right to have vehicles trespassing on my property cited or removed. They suggested I call a towing service next time I found her car there, but they also recommended giving a written warning to the neighbor, mailed by certified letter if possible. I decided to draft a formal letter referencing the local ordinances on trespassing and illegal parking. I quoted a couple of sections that explained how private property owners could have illegally parked vehicles towed at the owner's expense. Then I mailed it to Sarah's address, making sure the postage and return receipts were correct. A few days later, I got confirmation that someone at her house signed for the letter. I pinned my hopes on this approach, thinking that once everything was in writing, Sarah would realize I wasn't messing around. However, Sarah reacted by doubling down on her ridiculous stance. A week later, I found her on my property, leaning against her car with her arms folded. She glared at me as I walked over. "I got your letter," she said. "You can't intimidate me. My car's worth more than you'll make in your lifetime. No one's towing this beauty. I'm telling you right now, you can't just decide to bully me off your land." I calmly told her that it was not a matter of intimidation, but a matter of property rights and local laws. She refused to budge. Eventually, I just said, "Please leave now and do not park here again." She huffed, got in her car, and peeled out of my driveway, leaving a spray of gravel in her wake. It was becoming clear that a standoff was inevitable. While all this was unfolding, a separate storyline in my life revolved around an upcoming community garage sale. Each year, residents on our street coordinate to have a yard sale on the same weekend. It draws people from all over, and it's generally a pleasant time to meet neighbors and maybe declutter a bit. I had planned to put out some vintage furniture I inherited from an aunt, plus a few old gardening tools. Normally, I'd place them on my driveway or front lawn for easy display, but Sarah's invasive parking threatened to spoil the event for me. I confided in another neighbor, Carly, who lived 2 doors down. She said, "I wouldn't let Sarah ruin it for you. If she parks there, you have every right to call a tow truck. We all support you." Carly's encouragement helped me feel less alone. It seemed many neighbors were quietly rooting for me, probably tired of Sarah's brash behavior. As the garage sale weekend approached, Sarah kept up her antics. One afternoon, I came home to find tire marks across my lawn, leading to a small flower bed near the porch. Some of my newly planted marigolds had been crushed beneath the weight of Sarah's car tires. That was the final straw for me. I snapped a dozen photos of the damage, emailed them to the local homeowners association, though ours is relatively loose, and made a note to file a small claims case for property damage if I had to. The mental stress she was causing had gone far beyond a simple parking dispute. It was affecting my day-to-day life, my emotional well-being, and even the condition of my front yard. On the morning of the garage sale, I woke up early, set out tables, priced items, and prepared signs. I left the front half of my driveway clear so shoppers could pull up momentarily if they wanted to load heavy items. By 7 a.m., traffic started trickling in, and I sold a few kitchen gadgets. Around 9 a.m., Sarah's car showed up again, rolling right onto my driveway and partially blocking a table full of knickknacks. She stepped out holding a coffee cup and strutted over as if she owned the place. A few potential buyers looked on in confusion. I approached Sarah calmly but firmly, stating that this event was part of the community garage sale and she was not welcome to park there. She casually shrugged and said, "This is the best spot in the neighborhood, shaded, away from street traffic, and right next to your stuff so no one can ding my doors. I'm only here for a few hours, so deal with it." Furious, I told her to move or I would tow the car. She laughed, turned back to her vehicle and said, "Call whoever you like. They won't dare tow my car." Despite my frustration, I tried to maintain composure for the sake of the garage sale visitors. I texted a friend who worked for a local towing company, and he confirmed that as long as I had the required signage, which I did, and had made attempts to notify the vehicle owner, which I certainly had, multiple times, I could have the car removed. However, when the tow truck arrived, Sarah saw it turning onto our street. She quickly ran to her car, screaming, "You can't tow me!" She started up the engine and left, throwing more gravel in the process. The tow driver looked puzzled, and I apologized, giving him some money for his trouble. He promised to come back if Sarah returned and if I needed his services. Once Sarah fled, the rest of the garage sale day was peaceful. I managed to sell most of my old furniture, made decent cash, and connected with neighbors who sympathized with my ongoing predicament. By the end of the weekend, though, I was exhausted from constantly scanning the street, half expecting Sarah's car to appear again. I had no idea how far she would push this. A few days later, Sarah did indeed return to her old habits, parking squarely on my driveway as if nothing had happened. Something in me snapped that morning. I decided enough was enough. I called the local police department's non-emergency line, explained the situation in detail, and told them Sarah was refusing to remove her car from my private property. The officer asked if Sarah was present at the time. I said yes, she was still around. A patrol car arrived shortly thereafter. By then, Sarah was inside her car checking her phone. When the officer approached, she got out, looking both angry and somewhat rattled. I watched from my porch, anxious about how the conversation might unfold. Sarah told the officer a story that was completely opposite of reality. She claimed I had given her verbal permission months ago to park there whenever she wanted. She also insisted that I was harassing her and destroying her property. Her voice rose louder and louder, drawing neighbors out of their homes to watch from a distance. The officer glanced in my direction, confusion clearly visible on his face. I walked over, maintaining a respectful distance, and offered the written documentation I had. Logs of each time she parked without permission, photos, the certified letter, and all the damaged landscaping pictures. The officer asked Sarah to explain why she had ignored the letter and the signs. She sputtered, "He's lying. He's making all this up. My car is extremely valuable, and I don't need permission to park on a piece of land that's just sitting there." I could tell the officer was trying to remain impartial, but Sarah's arguments were so outlandish that he finally said, "Ma'am, you do not have the right to park on someone else's private property without explicit permission. If the homeowner says you need to move, you must move. Otherwise, your vehicle can be towed." Sarah rolled her eyes and whipped out her phone. To my astonishment, she dialed 911. She claimed she was calling to report an illegal attempt to tow her car, telling the dispatcher that the officer on the scene didn't understand the law and was oppressing her rights. Within minutes, another patrol car arrived, along with Sarah's outrage at the injustice being done to her. She repeated her bizarre story about having a permanent right to park there because her car was worth too much to subject it to public streets. The second officer conferred with the first, examined my documents, and quickly realized Sarah was in the wrong. Meanwhile, Sarah puffed up her chest, as though she believed that more officers arriving would bolster her argument. When they instead confirmed that I was legally allowed to have her car towed, she looked genuinely flabbergasted. She started yelling that no tow company had the authority to remove her car, that the law protected property owners of luxury vehicles, and that the rest of us didn't know how to appreciate fine things. It was so absurd I would have laughed if I wasn't so angry. One of the officers pulled me aside and asked if I wanted the vehicle towed right away. I looked at Sarah's smirking face and, after a moment's thought, told the officer yes. If I didn't do it right then, she would just come back the following day, convinced that no one could stop her. The officer made a quick call, and soon a tow truck was on its way. Sarah's jaw dropped when she realized this was actually happening. She started frantically calling someone, possibly a friend or relative, screaming, "They're taking my car! You need to get here now!" Within 15 minutes, the tow truck pulled up, and the driver stepped out, verifying the situation with the officers. Sarah flailed her arms, stepping between the tow truck driver and her car as if physically blocking him would deter him. The first officer stepped in calmly and said, "Ma'am, please step aside. You have been informed multiple times of the homeowner's rights. If you do not comply, we will charge you with obstruction." Even then, Sarah continued ranting, insisting that her car was immune to towing because it was too expensive. The tow truck driver raised an eyebrow but proceeded methodically, hooking the car up. There was a brief moment where Sarah tried to get back inside the vehicle, but the officer gently pulled her back. She sobbed, "I can't believe this is happening to me. You'll regret this." Her fury was so intense that I half expected her to lunge at me or the officers, but she seemed restrained by the presence of law enforcement. The driver finished attaching her car, and within minutes, it was on the flatbed, ready to go. As the tow truck pulled away, Sarah collapsed on the sidewalk, screaming about how unfair everything was. One of the officers told her calmly that she'd have to pay the towing fee plus any storage fees incurred if she wanted to get her car back. She glared at me like she wanted to burn holes through my soul. "I'll sue you for everything you have," she hissed. I calmly replied, "All I ever wanted was for you to stop parking on my driveway." The officers took a final statement from me, wrote up a brief incident report, and then left Sarah standing there, phone in hand, with no fancy car to show off. Over the next week, I heard from neighbors that Sarah had to pay a considerable amount to the tow yard. Some said they saw her meeting a tow truck at the yard, yelling at the staff there too. It didn't surprise me at all. That alone felt like justice, but the fallout continued in unexpected ways. A few days later, Sarah apparently tried to rally other neighbors against me, claiming that I was a tyrant who hated nice cars. Of course, this didn't go over well. Many neighbors she approached had already witnessed her behavior, or had at least heard rumors of her extreme entitlement. Most people shut the door in her face or told her they supported me. One neighbor, a middle-aged man named Hector, told her point blank, "Your problem is that you don't respect other people's property." I nearly laughed out loud when he recounted the story to me. It was good to know that folks in the community recognized the truth of what had happened. Around the same time, I was dealing with a separate subplot in my life, the greenhouse renovation. After all the drama, I realized I had neglected some basic chores and maintenance. I needed to replace some old wood in the greenhouse frame, fix a leaky roof panel, and restock on pots. So I spent a weekend immersed in that project, hauling materials in my truck, cutting wood, and carefully balancing the greenhouse temperature. Doing something constructive was a welcome break from the stress Sarah had caused. My cousin Francis returned to help out, and he couldn't stop shaking his head in disbelief at what had transpired with Sarah's car. "At least you got it resolved," he remarked, handing me a power drill. "People like her never learn unless it hits them in the wallet." While we worked, we also put up new security cameras. Francis had the idea that if Sarah or anyone else tried to trespass again, it would be good to have clear video evidence. We installed a camera pointing at the driveway and another one overlooking the front yard. Thanks to these cameras, I felt a bit more secure. If Sarah or her associates ever decided to retaliate, I'd have it all on film. Thankfully, days passed with no sign of Sarah or her car. I breathed a sigh of relief, hoping the fiasco had ended for good. Then, about 2 weeks later, Sarah resurfaced, though not in the way I expected. She came marching down the sidewalk with a piece of paper clutched in her hand. I was pruning some roses near the front when I saw her. She started ranting the moment she spotted me. "Look at this bill," she shouted, waving the paper at me. "Do you have any idea how expensive this was? You owe me for the towing and impound fees." I refused to engage beyond a brief, "I don't owe you anything." She responded, "Yes, you do. You set me up. You ambushed me with those cops." That statement was so bizarre it barely registered. I said, "Please leave my property. If you have a complaint, take it to small claims court." She scoffed, "Oh, you bet I will." Then she turned on her heel and stormed off. I kept an eye on her until she disappeared around the corner. A few more weeks went by, and I honestly thought Sarah was bluffing about suing me. Yet, one afternoon, I received a letter that indicated Sarah was indeed trying to bring a claim against me. The letter accused me of damaging her vehicle by allowing the tow truck to scratch the paint, harassing her, and causing emotional distress. It was riddled with inaccuracies and half-truths, but it was a real legal notice from the local small claims court. I was both annoyed and a little anxious. After all, being dragged into court is never fun. However, I felt secure in my evidence. I had documentation of her repeated trespasses, photos of her car on my property, the formal letter I had sent her, and even video footage from my newly installed cameras, showing how she behaved during the confrontation with the tow truck. I decided to hire a local legal consultant to make sure I presented everything correctly. The hearing date arrived, and I found myself sitting in a small, somewhat stuffy courtroom with Sarah on the opposite side, glaring daggers at me. The judge was a no-nonsense individual who quickly got to the heart of the matter. Sarah unleashed a dramatic tale of how I supposedly trapped her, stating that she had an oral agreement with me that gave her permission to park on my driveway. She rambled about how unfairly I had treated her, claiming that her car had special modifications that made towing it particularly risky. I stayed calm and simply handed over my documents, photos, and receipts, explaining that Sarah had never once been given permission to park on my property and had ignored repeated requests and warnings. The judge asked Sarah a few pointed questions, such as why she parked there even after receiving written notices, and how she could claim an oral agreement when there was clear photographic evidence of no such arrangement. Sarah's responses were inconsistent at best. She flailed, changed her story mid-sentence, and even tried to claim that I had used unauthorized signage to trick her. The judge, looking unimpressed, eventually ruled that Sarah's claims were unfounded and that she bore full responsibility for the towing and associated fees. Furthermore, the judge stated that it was entirely within my rights to have her car removed. Sarah's face was beet red. She barely looked at me as we left the courtroom. I'll never forget the judge's final remark. "This is a clear case of repeated trespassing. The homeowner had every right to protect his property." After that court loss, Sarah's presence in the neighborhood became less frequent. I noticed a "for rent" sign pop up in her yard a few weeks later, and I heard rumors from neighbors that she had decided to move closer to her new workplace. That news was a huge relief. Many folks in our area, especially those who had witnessed the spectacle, were glad to see her go. A peaceful atmosphere soon returned, with no more shouting matches or bizarre parking stunts to endure. Yet even as she was preparing to move out, Sarah made one last feeble attempt at stirring the pot. One morning, I noticed a piece of paper taped to my mailbox. It was a handwritten note, presumably from Sarah, saying something like, "You may have won this round, but don't think this is over. You messed with the wrong person." I rolled my eyes, took a photo of the note just in case, and threw it away. It was clear she was only lashing out because her illusions of entitlement had been shattered. She had no grounds to continue fighting me, legally or otherwise. The next day, a moving truck arrived at her place, and over the course of the weekend, Sarah and a couple of hired movers loaded up her belongings. During one trip in and out of her house, she spotted me in my front yard. For a moment, it looked like she was going to say something, but she turned away instead, slamming the door of the moving truck behind her. That was the last time I ever saw her in person. A few weeks after Sarah was gone, I happened to attend a neighborhood meetup at a local community center. People brought potluck dishes, and we chatted about upcoming events. Several neighbors who had quietly followed the saga asked me how everything turned out. I gave them the gist. Sarah's car got towed, she tried to sue me, and she lost. Some of them shared their own minor run-ins with Sarah, stories about her complaining of noise when kids were playing basketball in the street, or her lecturing a neighbor about how to properly wash a car to avoid devaluing the neighborhood. It seemed Sarah had left quite an impression on this little community, and not a positive one. In the months that followed, I focused on restoring my front lawn to its former glory. I replanted the marigolds that had been crushed by Sarah's tires, reseeded a few patches of grass, and finally replaced my worn-out fence with a sturdier one. I can't deny that the whole ordeal made me more protective of my space. I also expanded my greenhouse project, adding a mini irrigation system and experimenting with new plant varieties. The calm routine of watering, pruning, and watching tiny green shoots develop into thriving plants was exactly the kind of therapy I needed after dealing with Sarah's nonsense. A lingering subplot that ended up concluding much later involved my small claims case for the property damage to my landscaping. Initially, I had considered filing one, but Sarah moved away before I could finalize my claim. My photos clearly showed the damage to my lawn, and the estimate from a local landscaping company indicated it would cost a few $100s to fix. By the time I got all my documentation together, Sarah had apparently changed her address. My attempts to serve her with papers came back undeliverable. Eventually, I let it go. Tracking her down across different counties would have required more time and money than I was willing to spend. In the end, I found solace in knowing she had already spent a good sum on towing and legal fees. Plus, she no longer posed a daily threat to my property or my peace of mind. My cousin Francis and I remain close, and we still laugh about the day we installed those private property signs that Sarah so brazenly tore out of the ground. He jokes about how we should have embedded them in concrete, but in truth, I'm content with the way things played out despite the stress. It was a triumph of the basic principle that you can't just stomp on someone else's rights because you think you're special. I still have the official report from the day Sarah's car got towed. Every so often, I look at it and remember the surreal moment when she actually thought calling 911 would force the cops to defend her illegal actions. It's a reminder that entitlement is no match for the law and for documented evidence. Another interesting note is how my other neighbors and I grew a bit closer throughout the ordeal. Before Sarah's arrival, we were friendly but somewhat reserved, waving politely or saying a quick hello. After Sarah created so much drama, many of us bonded over the shared disbelief at her conduct. We formed a stronger sense of community, some of us exchanging numbers, offering to help if one of us went on vacation, or if we needed help with a project. If there was a silver lining to Sarah's outlandish behavior, it was that it actually brought the rest of the neighborhood closer together in our shared desire to maintain a respectful, welcoming environment for each other. Sometimes I get a twinge of empathy for Sarah, wondering how someone's life experiences could lead them to such a level of self-importance that they'd ignore every sign, every warning, and every polite request. Perhaps she had never been told no in her life, or maybe she simply felt that her material possessions entitled her to others' property. Regardless, I'm thankful that the law stepped in to prove her wrong. If there's any hope for her personal growth, maybe the financial hit and public embarrassment served as a wake-up call. But that's no longer my concern. To sum it all up, the saga started with me discovering a strange luxury vehicle on my driveway and ended with that same vehicle being hoisted onto a tow truck in front of half the neighborhood, right under the watchful eyes of the police. Sarah tried every trick in the book, from tearing down signs to calling 911 to filing a frivolous lawsuit. None of it panned out in her favor. In the end, she moved away, leaving behind nothing but a few ruts in my grass and a cautionary tale for everyone else. Now my property is secure, my greenhouse is flourishing, and my peace of mind is restored. If there's one lesson to take from this experience, it's that protecting your rights is crucial, and there's no car on earth so valuable that it trumps the law. Friends, thank you. See you soon.